Dictatorships have been a big part of the history of the world. While once they were the natural order of ruling, they are now considered an exception. Democracy is heralded as the way to rule, with incentives for those in power to please the majority of people, as well as mechanisms of accountability should they not follow the rules of the game. But even in this enlightened age of democracy, we see many dictatorships persisting. And not just persisting, but growing, as many countries tend towards less freedom. 2021 was the 16th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. Have a look at this map. Green shows the countries that are considered free and therefore democratic. They make up less than half of the map, while the non-free purple countries have taken over large areas. And the trend is that people all over the world have freedoms taken away, living in governments which increasingly move towards a more dictatorial form of government. All the areas tinted orange and red show decreasing freedoms for the population. And we can see that that is not just the areas that are typically considered less stable, but also countries like the Netherlands, France, and Portugal also exhibit this kind of behavior. Only very few countries are actually granting their people more freedoms, as can be seen by the green areas. With this in mind, it seems like a good time to look at the economic implications of the descent into a dictatorship. Welcome to Rebel Economics. In today's video, I will try to summarize what a dictatorial economy looks like. Myself, coming from a more of a political science background means that I'm really excited for today's video. Political economy has always fascinated me during my studies, so I'm thrilled that I get to talk about this again now. When we talk about dictatorships, we talk about a form of government in which absolute power is concentrated in one person or a small group of people. So why did I talk so much about the level of freedom earlier? Well, holding on to power is difficult, and there will always be people who don't like you or your policies. And without any mechanisms to get rid of a dictator, the opposition will choose protests, strikes, and rebellion in order to oust the unwanted autocrat. So you will need to take those freedoms away from them, and invest a whole lot of money to ensure that you will stay in power. But I get ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning of your reign. I will tell the tale of a typical dictator. This does not follow a specific country or example, and of course there are many variations and so many factors that can change how a dictator gets to and stays in power. But there are commonalities amongst many dictators in how they run the ship economically speaking. So, you start out an ambitious young person, malcontent in your current situation. The government is weak, your country is in turmoil, and faces economic hardship with a high rate of unemployment. You see how discontent much of the population is, and find that many other young people have the same grievances as you. But you are not like the others. Rather than sitting in a bar and complaining about the status quo, you choose to act. So, you put together a group of individuals who you can trust. People with the same vision and the same willingness to act. And act you do, you make your way up the ranks either politically or militarily, all the while ensuring that you build up the circle of like-minded people who will support you once the time is ripe. Whether this is through a little coup, ousting the current leader, or a breakdown of the system that leaves a vacuum of power, you manage to get to power. Having lived through these times of instability, you are determined that your reign will be different. So first, the political opposition is squashed through made-up charges or a rule of the state of emergency. You quench any opposition, and one of your first investments as a new dictator will be to either buy up or bribe the press, ensuring that not a negative word can be read about you. This will silence those with dissenting thought and repress freedoms. But you are nowhere close to done. Ruling is expensive, especially when you want to hold on for power as long as possible. So, you need to ensure that whatever asset the country has end up filling your pockets. This has been seen time and again by countries nationalizing local resources, especially natural resources like oil, coal, or diamonds. Now, the vast wealth that these natural resources provide will directly aid you in ensuring the longevity of your reign. And, of course, you need to make sure that your early supporters get something out of their loyalty to you. So you put them in important positions in ministries, the judicial, the police, the military, and also the newly nationalized companies. With the economic incentive being clearly in favor of loyalty to you, many will follow suit. But as you solidify your hold on power, you know the time will come when an uprising is just around the corner. Because while a select few are profiting, the overall population is still living in troubled times. So your third investment is the police and military. You need to make sure that all dissent is squashed immediately. So investing in brute force is a good strategy, but an expensive one. While the revenue from the national resources are vast, you have already spent a good deal on your supporters, and as a dictator of style, you also spend a share on your lavish lifestyle. But the bright side is your population is poor, with many young men willing to join the military just to have a secure job. But you are smarter than that. You make sure that these men too have a close connection to you. Whether this is because they come from the same province as you, have family ties, or follow the same beliefs. For them, following you is a mixture of economic prospect as well as personal ties. Now that you have secured your position, having already invested much of the readily available money, you can finally start a long-term plan for the economy of your country. In this regard, we have seen many different models. The communists clearly favor their 5-year plans, though looking at how poorly they have done, this should not be the path that you follow. So why is it that up to this point the path is pretty clear, but that dictatorships often F it up after the consolidation of power? Economy is a key reason here. We have talked plenty about expenditure, but apart from nationalizing the main resource of the country, there really has been little discussion about alternative ways of growing the GDP. Poor economic planning, as has been seen in the many communist dictatorships like Stalin and Mao, and the thirst for war like we have seen with Hitler, often impede dictatorships from being focused on their economic success. Yet, prior to the war, Nazi Germany did relatively well, considering the fact that while still being stuck in the post-war effects of World War I and the aftermath of the Great Depression. Up until the start of the Second World War, the GDP was rising and unemployment decreased from 30% at the beginning of Hitler's reign to be essentially non-existent by 1938. But of course, this came at a great human cost. With anyone who was deemed undesirable being shipped off to labor camps, much of the Nazi economy was running on slave labor, allowing for greater production rates without having to pay salaries. That will surely stimulate the economy. But also, with so many people being shipped off, many jobs were freed up for the part of the population that mattered according to the Nazis, and therefore decreasing unemployment. Similar strategies were seen in other dictatorships like Stalin and Mao, where labor camps were designed to get rid of anyone deemed undesirable by the dictator, squashing dissent and silencing critics, while still doing their part for the economy. But let's look at the bright side and move away from the horrendous human rights violations. Why might a dictatorial economy actually do well, at least in the short run? An article by Insider states that high development is associated with democracy in the long run, but dictatorships in the short run. This is because decision-making processes in a dictatorship are far shorter and therefore more efficient. Instead of being bogged down by rivaling parties, the dictator can simply exercise his authority, which is especially important in times of crises. After the 2008 crisis, for example, China was able to react far quicker and more decisively than the US. China's stimulus package, as a percentage of its GDP, was 3 times larger than the US fiscal stimulus. As a result, China bounced back quickly, while the US, Japan, and many other countries lagged behind. The same was true in the aftermath of the Great Depression. From 1933, when Hitler ascended to power, to 1938, the unemployment rate declined from 30% to 2%, and industrial production doubled. While this is of course related to the labor camps, Hitler also achieved this through massive government intervention and spending, the most well-known product thereof being the German Autobahn. At the same time, democratic counterparts like the US, UK, and France languished economically during the 1930s. The US only truly came out of the recession in the 1940s by its own massive government spending, only being able to do so because it was facing the military crisis of World War II. So if a dictatorship can actually do well in crises and are well known for short-term growth, why is it that this cannot be translated to long-term economic growth as well? Because while nothing stands in the way of good policies, nothing stands in the way of bad policies either. In democracies, when the government is pursuing a wrong policy, or one that is for the benefit of the governing parties and at the expense of the governed, election cycles are the way to hold politicians accountable. Citizens vote the party that governed in pure self-interest out of office. Kim Jong-il's regime in North Korea, for example, would have been voted out years ago. However, in dictatorships, wrong policies are allowed to persist for long periods of time because the government rules by force. Differing opinions are silenced at best and squashed at the worst. And there are some dictatorships which have done well in the past, when not driven by an ideology which focuses on 5-year plans or by the want to expand, starting a costly war. Just looking at the GDP growth, King Idris of Libya is the #1 most successful dictator of the past century, according to The Insider. During his rule from 1951 to 1969, he achieved a 9-time increase in the GDP per capita. But his rule was a short one, and the rise in GDP was owed to the discovery of oil. So instead, let's look at the second place, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. He was known as a benevolent dictator who, after 31 years of ruling from 1959 to 1990, stepped down at the age of 87. At the beginning of his rule, he was Prime Minister of the state of Singapore, which then was still part of Malaysia. He was a strong supporter of independence, which was achieved in 1965, making Lee Kuan Yew the first PM of Singapore as a country. During his reign, he provided a 6.5-time increase in GDP per capita. While following some of the necessary steps to remain in power, he curtailed press freedom, limited protests, restricted strike action, and brought defamation lawsuits against prominent political opponents. Yet, at the same time, his actions were seen as having been necessary for the country's early development. His economic understanding of building up the economy of a new country was sound, focusing on a large-scale manufacturing industry, and succeeding in keeping the docks which were originally built by the British. He made Singapore an interesting new market for foreign investment, especially of multinational corporations, a legacy which lasts to this day. He was a dictator who managed to combine the complete power of a dictator, yet imbued it with sufficient hybrid characteristics which made it appealing to the West, allowing for strong economic ties between the semi-autocratic ruler and democracies. So what does this mean for today's topic, the crazy economics of dictatorships? Dictatorships are not inherently making poor economic decisions, but two issues prevail. Firstly, focusing on other aspects of your rule, like expansion or ideology. These tend to overshadow the economic growth, which a dictatorship can achieve, and therefore pave the way to its destruction. Secondly, isolation is never a good policy. Hitler's isolation in Europe left him open to attacks from all sides. As a country with only few natural resources, manufacturing was a key element of its economic success in the mid-30s. But for manufacturing to lead to economic growth, you need markets you can export to. Therefore, having ties with other leading nations, which nowadays are largely democracies, you need to be appealing to them. One part is that they feel like they can trust you, and that their investment in your country does not end up being nationalized or eaten up by corruption. Therefore, putting on a face of semi-autocratic government rather than a full-on dictatorship can be helpful to establish a baseline of mutual understanding. I know there's surely much more to be said about this topic, but for now I want to leave it here. What do you think about the factors in a dictatorial economy that I maybe haven't mentioned yet? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching Rebel Economics and sticking with me throughout this video. I really enjoyed talking about this, so I hope you did too. If so, please like and subscribe, it really means a lot. If you want more content like this, check out our video asking if India will become an economic superpower, or the crazy economics of anarchism. I hope to see you again soon here on Rebel Economics, and have a great day.